Tine de Moor will kick off this session. Tine is Associate Professor at the Department for Social and Economic History of Utrecht University and studied social and economic history and environmental sciences at several universities at Ghent, Antwerp and London. Currently, she is in charge of two very large projects on institutions for collective action, and one of which, and we just chatted about it, is funded by a very sizable and prestigious grant from the European Research Council. And finally, Tine is also the director of ESTER, the European Graduate School for Training in Economic and Social Historical Research. Tine, we're looking forward to your contribution.
I hope this works. Oh, that's too fast. Okay, let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to present my work and that of others here. And also stress that when they did so, I really asked them, so what do you expect from me? Because I really think I will be the odd one out over there. And that for two reasons. The first one is that I have no health background whatsoever. But as most of the speakers have claimed the same so far, I think that problem is solved now. The second one is that I'm a historian, and historians don't tend to look forward. They usually look backwards. And I will try to explain to you why looking backwards might, after all, be a good idea. And I will do so for several hundreds of years, and that usually is not the scope, even not looking forward within policy or development planning or whatever. So it is quite a harsh task that I have in front of me here, but I will try to deal with it. Now, let's picture yourself, you go back a few hundred years in time to the mid of the 15th century, the period thereafter, the few centuries thereafter. If you would be there, you would notice that in that period of time, there was no effective technology to deal with all sorts of natural risks, but neither for other risks. I mean, I think you can imagine what the state of health and medical treatment at that point must have been. There was still not a complete market. The market was still very uncertain. But if you would have been in the Netherlands or the Low Countries and England in general, you would have found quite a well-developed market with very reasonable interest rates, pretty much like today, 5 to 6%. So a very integrated market already, and a free market for property to a certain extent. And agriculture was important for a large extent, but there was a lot of urbanization, technology was developing, and so on. So basically, there is a developing market. There are still uncertainties, but we're getting there. You would also see that it's quite politically unstable, that there are weak states, not the nation states we know that emerged in the 19th century, and that the powers that you could find were not like today. There were local powers. The national powers were absent or fighting out a war or something like that. So basically, top down, you couldn't expect much from the state. You could expect something from the church, who had some convents that took care of people, but nothing much from the state, as we do expect a lot from the state today. You would not expect either any redistribution of income, health insurance, not at all. Also, you would see that there is quite a bit of emigration from the countryside to towns and high levels of urbanization already in that period, especially in the period we are here, in the area we are here now. And this affected quite early onwards, from the late Middle Ages, family networks. People were more on their own. Elderly people had to take care of themselves already in that period. Family solidarity dropped. So all these things are actually quite familiar, I think, for a lot of people of you who work also in developing countries. Nor the state nor the market can actually support the dealing with risks sufficiently. Does this mean I say that current Africa is equal to pre-1800 Europe? No, I don't. Why I don't is that because there's a lot of regional diversity, of course, in Africa, also in Europe, and we compare a very small area of the Low Countries in England to a massive area. There's a lot of difference in household organizations. Family networks are usually still stronger in Africa today than they were in the early modern period in Europe. There's a different institutional memory. People don't have the same background in the kinds of institutions, both top-down and bottom-up, as we have in Europe. And on top of that, they also have the history of colonization in many countries. And we also have more technological solutions today than we used to have back then. But still, there's quite a bit of learning potential in our history. And that has to do mainly with the diversification and combination of risk management strategies that you can find in historical Europe. And within that spectrum of risk management solutions, you see a lot of effective institutional tools to govern certain resources that are actually the same in historical Europe as they are today in Africa, for example. I'll come back to that later. And also, if we compare a lot of institutions over time and in different areas, we see that a lot of those effective institutions have very similar characteristics. Now, if we would have been in the 16th century in the Netherlands, these would have been the major hazards we have to face. A lot of natural hazards struck every year. Snow, hail, extreme weather. Water, of course, in the Netherlands is very important. Drought might be important in Africa today. You have, of course, the regular plagues. I wouldn't compare this to AIDS, but I mean, it is a major major disease that affects a whole population. You have, of course, the usual sickness and so on. Political, this is not unfamiliar to you either. Warfare, even piracy is back on the agenda. And you have, of course, economic issues, expensive years, economic troubles, and so on. Now, we all know the four main important strategies to deal with risk: accept, avoid, transfer, or share. And what I would like to do is to show you how we did here in the Netherlands in pre-1800 period via different ways, and in particular one, the last one, institutions for collective action. There were ways to accept risks, for example, via services that were offered by supra-local institutions like this church at first, from the 16th century onwards, increasingly also by the state. So there's a community solution to accept risks. There's also a way to avoid risks by dealing it with among family members and with neighbors who can function as a safety network. There was already a market at that point to deal with the transfer of risk. For example, the market of life annuities was already from the 15th century onwards in the Netherlands extremely active and actually quite interesting to engage in. And the last one, the sharing of risks, the main institutional form by which that was done in pre-industrial Europe is by institutions for collective action. And we today would call them more or less cooperatives, if you would compare them. I'll come back to that later too. And basically, what is also important with these institutions, and which also link up quite easily to cooperatives, is that they combine livelihood economies with insurance systems. So they combine working together on the field or as a craftsman or a craftswoman, and several means of insuring yourself for both natural risks but also health risks and so on. And these four ways were actually combined in society. You see them over here. So via the market, via the individuals, community, and the collective. These are the types of risks that go with it. But what is important is that these, and that is typically for the Low Countries and England actually, which also links up to the Industrial Revolution debate, which I will not go into here, but it explains you where economic development in Europe comes from. It also shows you, if you look at these forms of risk, acceptance, avoidance, transfer, and sharing, that they actually communicate amongst each other. They use each other's institutional tools to do so. Now, I will be saying a bit more about the collective only, and to some extent about also the link with the market. Now, what are institutions for collective action, you might have been wondering? They are forms of institutions that are formed bottom-up, not by the state. The state can support the formation, but they are not forced into existence. They are self-governed, so the people who are benefiting from the institution set the institution themselves, they regulate it themselves, also restricting their own behavior, and they sanction each other and themselves, to a certain extent also themselves. And they set up rules and they have to follow them themselves. There is a direct link with livelihood activities, as I just said. It is a local instrument, so it's not from one homogeneous instrument that comes from the state top down. No, you have to take into account the local conditions. Often the institutions we're looking at, and that's where history comes in, are very resilient institutions. They're institutions that have survived for hundreds of years. I will give you some examples in a minute. And what is also important to know is that these institutions, they're not for everyone. They have limited access. The access is conditional. There are rules which you have to obey to be allowed to be a member. So in a way, it's exclusive and not entirely democratic. This is not communism or anything, what you might have thought of, which was not democratic either, but this is for groups of people who join and have to adhere to some rules. So you get access, that gives you a use right and a management right, but it is not a property right. That's different. Because people only get access and use rights, this gives them the possibility to plan on the very long term, because you don't have to transfer property, you only transfer a right. I will explain a bit more about that. But this fact also gives you the potential to reduce, for example, transaction costs. Now, what is important also with these institutions, at least in the historical perspective, is that social security arrangements, insurance issues, and so on, are an integral part of the incentive structures for members. So they can become a member and use the institution for their occupational needs. They need goods to buy goods collectively, or they need to put cows on the pasture. But if they don't do that properly, if they don't follow the rules for that, they won't either get insurance. They will be punished there too. So they are linked together. Now, there's two types of institutions I would like to demonstrate you here so that you get an idea of what I'm really looking at. First of all, commons. Commons are a really hot topic these days. And these days, when people talk about commons, they talk about shared resources in general. If we go back a few hundred years to the pre-industrial period, commons actually meant a piece of land that was used and managed collectively by a group of people. So not everybody could just simply enter the common. You had to be a member of it. Those date back from the 12th, 13th century in Europe, and that had to do with increasing population pressure that came on the land use, a mixed agriculture system. And because more and more people were actually reclaiming land, it was necessary to preserve some of the land, the pasture land, so to make sure that people could also put cows on it and that they could use the manure to put that on the arable land. And that, again, I think, mixed agriculture systems does also ring a bell for many of you who are involved in, for example, African land use that is aimed at self-sufficiency. Now, why did they do that? Because they needed that balance between arable land and agriculture and pasture land, so that they had sufficient manure from the cows that could be put on the arable land. Before that, you more had a family use, clan or tribe, whatever the areas you discuss. And why don't we know any more about these institutions? For the Dutch among you who come from the east, you might know the word markengenotschappen, or a meent if you're from the south of the Netherlands. Maybe those words still ring a bell, but most of those were dissolved during the late 18th, 19th century. And the very last one in the Netherlands was actually het Gooi, not so far from here, which was dissolved in 1975, but that was really an exception. This is just one example. I could give you hundreds of examples for the Netherlands and the rest of Europe. A markengenootschap called Raalterwold in Overijssel, which started, as you can see, in the 15th century and went on until the legislation of the mid-19th century. And we can actually study these institutions very well because there's quite a few sources. And one of the sources is our markenboeken, which describe the regulations that people use. So we know quite well how these institutions worked, what you could do and what you couldn't do. Now, it's not only in the past, it's also still today. And this is an extremely present-day example of only 2 weeks ago, whereby the government of Rajasthan in India decided to collaborate with local governance institutions to preserve and secure the functioning of commons. There's a long story behind it. There's much more information on that chair if you want to know more about the Indian situation or other issues related to that. But this is just to show you this is still going on in a lot of developing countries, but the existence of commons is often due to the pressure of the state or private property organizations no longer recognized. So it is not something only of the past. Another example, which actually is maybe even more relevant to you, although it doesn't have anything to do with agriculture, are the craft guilds in the Netherlands. And why is it more relevant? Because these institutions focused even more on social security and on the provision of insurance arrangements for sickness, for widows, orphans, and, for example, also burial costs, which are a very important part of the cost African people have to deal with in many cases. Well, these were provided for people who were a member of these craft guilds. So if you were a master in the craft, you had to pay for these, but in the end you would get the benefits that were promised. And here, these are closely related to the development of urbanization in the Low Countries that goes on from the 13th, 14th century. A lot of urbanization comes up. So that's mainly also related to demography. If you would look at the very long term after the dissolution of the guilds as well at the end of the 18th and early 19th century in Europe, you would see that they actually have a lot in common with labor unions and state-provided health insurance, but in a split way. The health insurance went to the state government, and the parts that had to do with labor organization went to labor unions. Guilds united both. Now, why do we need to understand both, I think, to relate to the present-day situation? I think because, first of all, guilds, they have this more integral combination of livelihood or economies and social security, and this affects the incentive structures that are set out. And they're mainly urban, so for a lot of people working in developing countries, that wouldn't be the ideal setting. On the other hand, commons are dealing mainly with non-urban or rural societies. So there you have a connection with the type of livelihood that is important. Now, this is a very abstract overview of where you have to situate these types of institutions within the spectrum of goods. They're not public goods, the goods they deal with. They're not private goods, and they're actually not the type of common pool resources a lot of people associate today with the term commons. The type of goods, guilds and commons in the past we're dealing with are goods that were, because of their institutionalization, highly excludable, so you could set limits to the use of those goods, of those resources. And they were low in subtractability because they could be replaced. So we could have called them club goods. And the same goes more or less for cooperatives. And also, I've been reading a bit about health insurance, but I know nothing about it. But it struck to me that it coincides more or less with what you could call community-based health organization, more or less. Now, why do people do this? Why do people go together, and why don't they just go private? You know, why didn't they let the state take care of it? That has to do with several important advantages, economic advantages of institutions for collective action. You can create economies of scale, buy goods together, or put a fence around the common instead of fencing every single part. You can have a better collective bargaining position towards authority to get more rights. You can share risks and resources. The information cost, the search cost, the transaction cost, policing costs, all those are usually lower than in the case of private property arrangements. I could talk a long time about this, which I won't, but there's clear indications that there are many benefits to it. Now, what is most important, I think, also for today, to see what these institutions can do for resource management in general, not only natural resource management, is that they stress self-governance. Maybe this sounds a bit as naive, but there are a lot of studies also on commons today which show that if you leave monitoring and sanctioning within these institutions in the hands of the direct stakeholders, you have a higher effective and efficient outcome, both economically but also socially and for the community. This has to do with the fact that these institutions are set up on the basis of, for example, the right and the obligation to vote in meetings and to be present, to elect, to have the election of your own representatives of the institution, but also to rotate responsibilities. For example, who has to check whether people are not free riding? That is not a pleasant task to do. You don't want to say, hey, you're putting one cow too many on the common. But that job also has to rotate. And if it rotates, it usually works better. There's also other management tools that show that self-governance can work and can be more effective often than other ways. For example, via auto monitoring, so self-control as I just explained, but also, for example, with a specific type of fines that are used when people are free riding. 3 strikes and you're out. So if you're not obeying the rules and you do this 3 times, you're no longer a member. But also liability clauses. If I see that you make a mistake, that you are free riding, and I don't report this to the person who has to sanction it, I also get sanctioned. So it works both ways. Doesn't sound very nice, but it works. And other things like restricting use levels to direct livelihood needs, which means that you can limit commercialization. For example, people don't get to use more turf or more woodland than they actually would need to reconstruct their house or make their fires, linked to the size of their household. So people can't overuse. Yes? 3 minutes. Okay, I'm nearly there. So basically, if you compare state arrangements, public arrangements, collective action arrangements, and market and private arrangements, this is basically these are the problems and the opportunities. I focus a bit on the problems with state and market because I'm here, of course, to advocate collective action. But at the state side, you do see that it involves high administration cost and not always effective regulation because it's costly to persecute and punish defectors. And not every state has a system that works well to persecute and punish defectors. On the market side, it's often expensive to organize such resource use because you have the externalization of costs. Sanctioning is not effective via the private way. Whereas if you look at collective action arrangements for the institutions I've been talking about, you see that self-regulation and sanctioning can actually be cheaper and is often very effective, and that the effects of individual behavior on the group are felt directly by all the group members. So people also behave differently if they see that individuals are following the rules. Now, how can we apply what I've just been saying to what to today? You're all very much in the present day with both feet, I think. I only study dead cows and so on, so that's completely different. But what can you do with the knowledge that historians, and not only me, I work in a larger association that looks also at commons today. What can you do with that? I think several things. And much of what I'm going to say is based on the work of that lady on top of there. She's Elinor Ostrom, my personal guru. And she's the Nobel Prize winner for economics of 2009. And she wrote, amongst others, the books I'm just showing. But these are actually for me, the main works so far. Now, these are just some of the things she's saying. What you see is that in between market and state, as I just showed, there is a lot of institutional variety which has to take into account local conditions, but can be used for many different kinds of resources to manage them effectively. So what we could do is look at the tools that are available, both in present and past, to govern resources collectively and try to adapt them to local conditions today. What is important is that these institutions can be resilient, so they can go on for a long period of time, which reduces costs at intermediate periods. You don't have to explain time and time again to individuals what they have to do, because there's a constant rotation of people from generation to generation who move into the organization, who die and then are being replaced, for example, by others in the village. What is very important, I think, is that there's a combination of social security and insurance with livelihood collective action. So they combine these things, which makes it more compulsory to obey to each of the sides of the coin. So you have to follow the rules in terms of things that have to do with your occupation or your farming, in order to also to get the social insurance benefits. This also gives us a potential to address different risks. So there's a lot of different types of risks that are managed within the same institutional framework. So you can use the money you have collectively at different periods of time according to different needs. If there's a flood, if there's a drought, you use the money then. But if there's that, you can spread it for those issues as well. Self-governance is extremely important. But, which is most important maybe, is also that there's no one claiming within the field of commons research that commons or institutions for collective action can work in every situation and at all times. There's different local conditions, technologies change, and the value of resources also influences the type of institutions you would want. If you're interested in knowing, I'm finished. If you're interested in more information about this, there's a lot of booklets over there of the International Association for the Study of the Commons. There's a journal about this, and there's also several projects I'm running in which you also find information there in Utrecht. So be my guest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tine, for a very informative and engaged presentation. We have time for a couple of questions, comments, and as this morning, please mention your name and affiliation.
Can you say something on the growth from these models, starting from risk sharing first towards income solidarity, so that the reach of these systems and the institutions that you need to go out to the real poor and that you can cover everybody, how this has happened over time, and then especially in the last 80 years?
So, 100 years. Okay, well, there's actually a very long evolution behind it, which is really interesting if you look at the present-day outcome. What you see over a very long period, and that's 800 years, is that first it started basically, actually in the very beginning, there were religious communities, for example, the guilds I'm talking about. Then they moved into occupational groups, so basically the main goals at that point were economic. People wanted a minimal income, they wanted quality of goods, so they wanted to secure that what they made would be paid, would be bought by a steady group of customers at the same level. And they also provided insurance at first, but only for the master's level. So only those people who went through the whole educational level, they got insurance benefits. Now what happened, and this also has to do with income distribution and so on, what happened is that the people who were at the bottom of these institutions, for example, the apprentices and the journeymen and so on, so people who are not masters, they didn't have the full insurance. And during the 16th century, which is a period of serious economic problems, just before the golden age, but before that were problems, you see that a lot of these lower level people, so not the masters, set up their own insurance companies. They are called journeyman's boxes or knechtsbussen in Dutch. So then you also see a diversification in the types of people with different incomes and insurance systems. And basically this developed towards labor unions, and what happened in the 19th century is that the state took over most of the health insurance systems that were already developed before that within the guild system. So it didn't come out of the blue, but it was based on this kind of mutuals, basically. So, and also cooperatives, a lot of mutuals or mutual insurances based themselves on that system. But does this answer your question entirely?
Schultz, AIGRD. This is a question with a lot of ignorance, so there may be a matter of klokhorenluiden and so on. But when you talk about guilds, I immediately think about Amsterdam in the golden century. And then also strikes me the VOC and the history that was the start of aandelen, assets and investments. So can you say, what was the role of, did these guilds invest in the way that we talk now about aandelen and shares, thank you. And how did that contribute to their maintaining the assets of the guilds, and how would you compare that with current situations, or could you say something about that?
You have to make a difference there, which I didn't because it would make things more complicated, between merchant guilds and craft guilds. Merchant guilds, and the VOC was, well, a combination of merchant guilds, you could say. They had a lot of capital going around the world. So what they did was they invented shares, so to speak, which made it also possible, for example, to buy part of a ship. So if the ship went down, it wasn't, maybe you had several ships you invested in, so okay, one ship gone, but you shared the risk there. So that's different from what I was just explaining. These are people who are, and I think probably this is for today more relevant, in the sense that these are people who are getting together on the basis of their occupation, which has nothing or not much to do with commerce in itself, but in production. They focus on production, not on the commercial side of it. These people, they might have had shares. In fact, shares were, even the very common people often had shares of ships. We have evidence of people with fairly low incomes having a share in the 15th century, or the 16th century in this case. So basically, the people who were focusing on production wouldn't have engaged that much in commerce or in keeping shares unless they really wanted some rent from it, some financial gain from it, but that wouldn't have to do much with their being a member of the guild as such.
One more question?
Mine. Quick comment. I'm glad you're not a health person. I'm a health person. I work with the World Bank Group. I'm very interested in the history and culture and how those things shape what we do now. Contrary to what people think, in a lot of African societies, there is a history of assurance, if not necessarily insurance. I won't have time to explain that, but it's a collective way of doing things. So collectivity is not new to Africa. The big issues that we have been how history links and contributes to where we are now, both the colonial and post-colonial. The key thing about collectivity is the maintenance of collectivity and a culture continuously. And we see that with the advance of colonialism and the church, the two things that had to be broken down were that culture of collectivity, because it gave you the backbone to resist, and the culture of what you believe in, so belief had to disappear. That was done during the pre-colonial time with governments that didn't have full control of the whole community. It was mainly the urban areas, the rural areas. There was really no colonial control over there. Then the new governments come in at independence that also don't have full control of the community and society because of the inefficiencies. So we have a situation here where you have central governments that do not have full control of the whole society, but societies that have lost touch with what was cultural. So now we come in trying to create collectivity in areas of insurance and so on, and is brought in as something that is extremely new and foreign. And the question here is, how do we build on what was there but was lost, so that people see this thing as not necessarily foreign, but something that has happened and can help us move forward? Because that is where the problems of insurance, as we are bringing it now, becomes an issue for us.
Very, very nice question and very relevant, I think. Well, first of all, I think how do you bring it back is by acknowledging that there is still a lot there. The association I'm working with, the International Association for the Study of Commons, we have a lot of people in developing, actually the majority of our members is from developing countries where there is a lot of capital, social capital and human capital still available about collective management of resources. The problem is, however, that the state indeed today doesn't always recognize the presence of that still, whether it is built on very ancient roots or present day. I mean, sometimes these are very recent institutions for collective action, but they function. But another problem is that a lot of financing institutions, the larger ones like IMF and so on, they often demand that if they invest in a lot of these communities, the land is privatized. Actually, the European Commission had a policy like that until recently, and they changed it so that local traditional forms of property rights can still be acknowledged. This is really vital, that the non-typical market-oriented institutional arrangements that are still present are recognized as viable ways to organize resource management. And that is not always the case. I think it's changing, but it's difficult. And for example, the picture of Rajasthan I showed, and the government that acknowledges this, that is of vital importance, I think, to that there are governments that recognize that there is another way to organize natural resource management in a government or a market way.